As fans eagerly anticipate the Rings of Power Season 2, many might be wondering about the lore behind the 9 rings for men, which play a significant role in the story of Middle-earth. These Rings of Power were crafted with the sole purpose of being controlled by Sauron, leading to the corruption of men and transforming them into his dark servants, the Nazgûl or Ringwraiths. But during the timeline of The Lord of the Rings, where exactly are these 9 powerful rings? Why don't we see them in the main story, and what happens to them after Sauron's defeat? To explore these questions, we need to dive deep into the world that Tolkien created, considering both the books and other supplementary texts. This will shed light on the mysterious fate of the 9 rings for men and their whereabouts during the events of The Lord of the Rings. Before focusing on the 9 rings for men, it's essential to understand the broader context of the Rings of Power. In total, there are 20 Rings of Power in Tolkien's Legendarium, each created for different races of Middle-earth. The most significant of these is, of course, the One Ring, which Sauron uses to control the others. The breakdown of the Rings of Power is as follows. 3 rings for the elves. These are the most powerful and untainted by Sauron's influence. They remain with Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf during the events of The Lord of the Rings. 7 rings for the dwarves. These rings were given to the dwarves, but most of them were either destroyed or lost long before Frodo's journey began. 9 rings for men. These 9 rings were the ones most directly corrupted by Sauron. They were given to powerful kings and warriors who were eventually turned into the Nazgûl, the ringwraiths that serve Sauron without question. In the Rings of Power Season 2, we'll see the creation of the 9 rings and how Sauron manipulates Celebrimbor into crafting them for the race of men. The rings, once distributed, serve as instruments for Sauron to corrupt the men who receive them. These men eventually become the Nazgûl, bound to Sauron's will for eternity. By the time The Lord of the Rings begins, the 9 rings have already fulfilled their purpose. The men who once wore them have long since been transformed into the Nazgûl, ghostly servants of Sauron who hunt for the One Ring. This transformation into ringwraiths means that the physical manifestation of the 9 rings is no longer critical to the story. However, the question remains, where exactly are the 9 rings during the events of The Lord of the Rings? According to Tolkien's writings, the 9 rings for men are either still held by the Nazgûl or have been reclaimed by Sauron by the time the events of The Lord of the Rings unfold. This distinction may seem trivial at first glance, but it raises a significant point about Sauron's control over the Nazgûl and his influence in Middle-earth. In the Fellowship of the Ring and Unfinished Tales, there are several references indicating that Sauron collected the 9 rings during the Third Age. It's suggested that he holds onto them for safekeeping, ensuring his dominion over the ringwraiths, who have no choice but to follow his commands. This would mean that by the time Frodo embarks on his journey, the 9 rings are in Sauron's possession, hidden away in Barad, Dur, or another dark corner of Mordor. However, there's an interesting contradiction in the Fellowship of the Ring. During the Council of Elrond, Gandalf makes a statement that seems to conflict with this idea. He says the 9 the Nazgûl keep, suggesting that the ringwraiths still have their rings of power during the events of the story. This could mean that while Sauron controls the Nazgûl, they might still physically carry the 9 rings with them, reinforcing their link to Sauron's will. It's possible that both statements are true. The Nazgûl may retain their rings of power for most of the Third Age, with Sauron reclaiming them sometime before or during the events of The Lord of the Rings. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether Sauron or the ringwraiths hold the 9, as Sauron's control over the Nazgûl is absolute. The rings serve as symbols of the men's corruption and enslavement, but their physical presence is secondary to their role in the larger narrative. Though we don't see the 9 rings explicitly in the story, the Nazgûl themselves are a constant presence throughout The Lord of the Rings. They are among Sauron's most terrifying and loyal servants, tasked with hunting down Frodo and reclaiming the One Ring. Their eerie, spectral nature is a direct consequence of the 9 rings. The men who originally received these rings were powerful kings and sorcerers, but their prolonged exposure to the power of the rings slowly eroded their humanity. Over time, they faded into shadow, existing only as wraiths bound to Sauron's will. The 9 rings, therefore, are responsible for creating some of the most iconic villains in Tolkien's world. The Nazgûl's presence in the story highlights the danger posed by the Rings of Power, as well as the corrupting influence of Sauron. Their obsession with the One Ring and their relentless pursuit of Frodo shows how deeply their fate is tied to Sauron's, making them key antagonists in the quest to destroy the One Ring. One of the most intriguing questions regarding the Nine Rings is what happens to them after Sauron is defeated in the Return of the King. When Frodo destroys the One Ring by casting it into Mount Doom, Sauron's physical form is annihilated, and his spirit is rendered powerless. But what does this mean for Nine Rings? Since the Nine Rings are closely linked to Sauron's power, it's reasonable to assume that they either perish with him or lose their potency after the destruction of the One Ring. The three rings for the elves remain intact, but they lose their power after Sauron's defeat, suggesting that the Nine Rings might follow a similar fate. The ringwraiths themselves are destroyed when Sauron falls, so it stands to reason that their rings either share their fate or become inert, unable to influence the world without Sauron's dark magic. Tolkien never provides a definitive answer to the fate of the Nine Rings, but based on the evidence in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, it's likely that they are either destroyed or rendered powerless after the One Ring is destroyed. The Nine Rings for men play a crucial role in the lore of The Lord of the Rings, even though they aren't physically present in the main story. Their influence is felt through the terrifying presence of the Nazgûl, who serve as a constant reminder of Sauron's corrupting power. Whether the Nine Rings are in the hands of the ringwraiths or held by Sauron himself, their role in Middle-earth's history is undeniable. After Sauron's defeat, the Nine Rings either cease to exist or lose their power entirely, marking the end of their dark influence over Middle-earth. Yet, their legacy endures in the minds of fans and within the vast mythology that Tolkien created. They stand as symbols of the dangers of power, corruption, and the ultimate price of ambition, themes that resonate throughout The Lord of the Rings and beyond.